The year was 2125. The world had long since moved on from the space age. Space exploration had faded into the history books, replaced by the rush of daily life and the pursuit of more grounded technologies. No one was expecting a message from the past, especially not one that would shatter everything humanity thought it knew about the universe. It started as a routine anomaly, detected by Earth's orbital defense system. A faint blip on the radar, barely noticeable, slipping in and out of tracking systems. The first reaction from the team at Earth's command center was simple disbelief. Impossible, they thought. No space probe had been launched in over 50 years. Any long-lost missions had long since fallen into obscurity. Yet this signal wasn't just an anomaly. It was growing stronger. It was real. A name flashed across the screen. Apollo 17X. The probe, an experimental space vessel, had launched 100 years ago with a simple mission: to explore the distant edges of our solar system. It had been lost, presumed destroyed, after it had mysteriously lost contact just days into its journey. Now, after a century of silence, it had returned, without any warning and without any explanation. But there was something more troubling than the fact of the probe's return. As the team analyzed the data, the unmistakable signature of a message began to surface, fragmented and broken, but there. And the message wasn't just some standard scientific log. It felt alive. The data was distorted, glitching in and out, almost as though the message was struggling to be understood. "We have to investigate," Dr. Elena Carter, the lead scientist at the command center, said quietly, though she felt the chill of dread crawl up her spine. She was the first to realize that something was very wrong. This wasn't just about a lost probe. It wasn't even about a mystery that had been buried for 100 years. It was about what was now being uncovered, a message that shouldn't exist. As the team worked to decode the broken fragments, the room began to grow colder. Dr. Carter stood in front of the massive screen, her eyes fixed on the fluctuating data stream. The message wasn't just a series of random numbers and characters. It was slowly forming coherent words. Each new sequence brought more clarity, but the more they decoded, the more the sense of unease grew. What was this message? Where had it come from? And why had the probe waited until now to send it? The message, once cracked open, was eerily simple yet horrifying in its implication. "Help us. You are not alone. They are coming." The screen flickered once more, as though the message was trying to convey something deeper, something hidden. The room fell into silence, as every person present in the control room felt an unnerving presence. The message wasn't just a warning. It felt like a cry for help. But help from whom? What did this space probe encounter out there? And why had it taken 100 years to return? The room buzzed with tension, the air thick with unanswered questions. Dr. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed the probe back. A presence, something dark that had been waiting. And now, it had come for them. The year was 2123, and the world was shaken by a revelation that no one could have ever predicted. A space probe, thought to have been lost forever a century ago, had just re-emerged from the void. The probe, designated NSS-11, had disappeared in 2023 during its mission to explore the outer reaches of the solar system. The mission, once hailed as the pinnacle of human exploration, had been abruptly abandoned after communication with the spacecraft was lost without a trace. For 100 years, the probe was presumed to be lost to the stars, forgotten in the annals of space exploration. Yet here it was, returning from the deep, its once dormant systems now active again. The moment it reappeared on Earth's radar, the entire planet stopped in its tracks. How could this be? What could have brought it back? Dr. Elena Carter, who had been at the forefront of space exploration for decades, found herself at the center of this unbelievable discovery. She had spent her career studying the universe's secrets, and now she was faced with an answer to a question that had lingered for over a century. The NSS-11 had returned, but it wasn't just a spacecraft. It was a time capsule, a vessel that had traveled far beyond the limits of human understanding. And as its systems began to re-establish contact with Earth, something else became clear. The probe had brought something back with it. The initial scans of the craft showed no signs of damage. It was as pristine as it had been when it left Earth all those years ago. But there was something different about it now. A faint signal was coming through, something encoded in a strange pattern. The signal wasn't just a random noise from space. It was deliberate. It was a message. "What is this?" Dr. Carter asked, her voice tinged with a mix of disbelief and curiosity. Her eyes remained fixed on the holographic display, where the decoded message was slowly coming into view. The message wasn't in any language she recognized. The symbols were alien, shifting and pulsating in a pattern that made no sense at first. Dr. Carter's hand hovered over the console, hesitating. She could feel it, a weight, an oppressive presence embedded within the message. The moment felt surreal. The entire world was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. "This can't be possible," Dr. Carter muttered, running her fingers over her forehead, trying to process the magnitude of what was unfolding. She felt a strange sense of unease washing over her. The probe had returned after 100 years of silence, and now it was speaking. But who or what was it speaking for? As the symbols continued to appear on the screen, Dr. Carter made a chilling realization. This wasn't just a scientific anomaly. This was something else entirely. The message was alive, and whatever had sent it wasn't of this world. "We have to decode it," Dr. Carter said, her voice firm, now filled with purpose. The world had just taken an irreversible turn. What had begun as a curiosity was now an enigma that could unravel the very fabric of human understanding. The message had arrived, and it was clear. Humanity was no longer alone in the universe. The atmosphere in the control room was thick with tension. Every eye in the room was focused on the massive screen, where the cryptic message from the NSS-11 probe continued to shift and distort. The symbols, once incomprehensible, now seemed to form coherent sequences, though their meaning still eluded the team. The room buzzed with an energy that could only be described as both thrilling and unsettling. For years, humanity had searched for signs of life beyond Earth, and now it seemed the answer had found them. Dr. Carter sat in front of the console, her fingers poised above the keys. Sweat beaded on her forehead, not from the warmth of the room, but from the gravity of the situation. The message wasn't like anything she had encountered before. It wasn't just an alien transmission. It was more like an invitation, a beckoning, and it was waiting for them to respond. "Can we isolate the patterns?" one of the engineers, Ben, asked, his voice filled with urgency. He had been working tirelessly to decipher the strange symbols, but even with the best computational models available, they were still no closer to understanding the message. Dr. Carter's mind raced. "I don't know, but we need to try something different. These symbols, they're too organized. This isn't random noise." She paused, narrowing her eyes as another set of symbols appeared on the screen. It's almost as if they're trying to speak to us. They're evolving, reacting to our presence. The rest of the team gathered around, their eyes fixated on the screen as the symbols continued to shift, almost like they were being drawn in real time. The structure was unlike any form of language they had encountered. No known alien language had ever been discovered in human history, but the patterns in front of them were undeniably deliberate. They weren't just deciphering code, they were witnessing an evolving dialogue. "We need to approach this like a conversation," Dr. Carter said, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. "Whatever this is, it's trying to communicate with us, and we have to respond in kind." Ben nodded and began inputting new commands into the system. Slowly but surely, the team began to see the subtle shifts in the transmission. The symbols on the screen weren't just changing. They were becoming more complex, more precise. It was as if the message was learning from them, adapting to their actions. The feeling in the room shifted as the air seemed to hum with a low vibration, a sensation they could feel in their very bones. "I don't think we're just decoding something," Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think it's reading us. It knows we're here." Dr. Carter nodded grimly, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure how to explain the sensation, but it was undeniable. This wasn't a simple exchange of information. It was a two-way communication, and it was becoming clear that they were not alone in this process. Whatever intelligence was behind the message, it was aware of them. It was alive. The room fell silent as they watched the symbols shift again, this time forming a pattern that resembled a circle. In the center of the circle, a single word appeared, unfamiliar, but somehow familiar at the same time. Dr. Carter's breath caught in her throat as the word materialized on the screen. "Welcome." The word lingered in the air, vibrating with a strange energy. The team exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to make of it. They had been waiting for answers, but now they realized the answers might come with consequences they weren't prepared for. The unknown had just stepped into their lives, and it was only beginning. The word "welcome" glowed on the screen, vibrating through the room like an unspoken command. It wasn't just a greeting. It felt like an opening, a declaration that something beyond human comprehension had begun. Dr. Carter stood frozen, a chill creeping up her spine. The room had changed. It wasn't just about data or decoding anymore. This was contact, a direct communication, and it was clear that they had crossed a line. "Do we respond?" Julia's voice broke the silence, full of uncertainty. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the same fear that Dr. Carter felt but could not yet voice. "Is this an invitation?" Dr. Carter stared at the screen, her heart racing. The transmission was no longer a cold, one-way exchange of signals. It had transformed into something far more dynamic, alive, evolving, as if the message itself was aware of their presence. The more they deciphered, the deeper they were pulled into a mystery that felt alive, as if something or someone was waiting. "We have to," Dr. Carter said, the words falling from her lips with an authority she didn't feel. "We've opened the door. Now we have to step through it." The weight of the decision pressed on her chest. Every piece of training, every simulation she had done in preparation for a moment like this suddenly felt insufficient. The lost NSS-11 probe had returned after 100 years, and now the message had arrived. It was clear they had been chosen, but chosen for what? "We're not ready," Ben whispered from his station, his eyes filled with the same fear that gripped the others. "What if we're making a mistake? What if we've opened something we can't close?" His words struck a chord deep within Dr. Carter. They weren't just interpreting alien symbols. They were stepping into a territory so unknown, the implications of their actions were beyond any human measure. Yet the invitation was undeniable. They had come this far. There was no turning back. "What if this thing isn't what it seems?" Paul asked, his voice shaking. "How do we even know what it really wants from us?" Dr. Carter felt her throat tighten. How could they know? The probe had been lost for a century, and this message had been hidden for reasons beyond their comprehension. What if it was a trap? What if it was something dangerous, waiting to be unleashed? "We don't know," Dr. Carter replied, her voice steady but filled with doubt. "But we have no choice. It's already set in motion. We have to respond." Her words hung heavy in the room, sinking in with the rest of the team. This wasn't just about discovery anymore. This was about a choice, one that could have repercussions they couldn't possibly predict. The room fell silent as Dr. Carter entered the command, her fingers trembling on the console. The response would send them further into the unknown, and whatever awaited them was no longer just a question. It was a challenge. They had no answers, only this invitation. "Let's proceed," Dr. Carter said, her voice firm but her heart pounding. "We're in this together. We have to see it through." The team held their breath as they sent the response. The word, "welcome," faded from the screen, replaced by a new message more cryptic and unsettling than before. It wasn't just an exchange. It was the beginning of something far greater, and they had already crossed the threshold. The unknown had begun to respond. They had no idea what lay ahead, but they had already made their choice. The air in the control room had thickened, an oppressive silence hanging over the team as they waited. The word "welcome" was gone, replaced by an ominous sequence of shifting symbols that seemed to pulse in rhythm. Dr. Carter stared at the screen, her thoughts racing as she tried to process what was unfolding before her eyes. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the monitors, but the atmosphere felt charged, as if the walls themselves were alive and listening to every breath they took. "We're really doing this," Julia said, her voice breaking the silence. She sounded both terrified and exhilarated, the weight of their situation settling in. "We're answering back to whatever this is." Dr. Carter's fingers hovered above the keyboard. The decision they had to make now wasn't just about responding to a message. They were interacting with something far more significant, something that had been lost for a century, and now, in the form of this cryptic invitation, had reappeared. But what would responding truly mean? Would they be opening a door they couldn't close? "We don't have all the answers," Dr. Carter said, her voice steady, though inside she felt a swirling storm of uncertainty. "But we have to make a decision. We can't stand here forever." She looked at the rest of the team. Ben, who had been quiet, still seemed conflicted. Paul looked at the screen, his hand resting on the desk as if he was waiting for the message to do something. There was a sense of urgency in the room that couldn't be ignored. The symbols were changing again, growing clearer, more complex, as if the message was challenging them to answer. "We've already crossed the line," Dr. Carter continued, her words cutting through the tension. This isn't just a question of curiosity anymore. We've made contact. Now we have to decide what to do with it." The weight of her words settled over them like a blanket. There was no going back now. They could shut down the console, walk away, and pretend that none of this ever happened. But could they? The probe had returned after a century of silence, and with it, a message, an invitation. Dr. Carter could feel the gravity of their situation. They had the potential to unlock something extraordinary, but they could just as easily unleash something far darker. "Are we ready?" Ben asked, his voice small, unsure. "What if we don't understand what this thing is asking of us? What if we can't handle it?" Dr. Carter's gaze drifted back to the screen. The symbols were now rearranging into shapes, more intricate than anything they'd encountered before. They were mesmerizing, almost hypnotic, drawing her in. "We don't know what this thing is, but that's what we've been trained for," Dr. Carter said. "We've trained for the unknown, for discovery. We've been given an opportunity to make history, but we have to decide now if we're willing to face whatever comes next." The air was thick with the team's unspoken agreement. They had crossed a threshold. This wasn't just about a lost space probe. This was about humanity's first step into something that could change everything. With a deep breath, Dr. Carter typed the final command, sending their response back into the void. The screen flickered, and the strange symbols settled into place. The team stared, their hearts pounding in their chests. The decision had been made. The unknown awaited them, and they were already too far in to turn back now. The room was still, the only sound the hum of machinery in the background. Dr. Carter sat at the control panel, her eyes locked on the screen, watching as the symbols shifted and pulsed in rhythm. The transmission had been sent, and now all they could do was wait. An oppressive silence filled the room, thick with anticipation. Each member of the team could feel the weight of what had just happened, the implications slowly sinking in. Julia stood behind Dr. Carter, arms crossed tightly, her face tense with worry. "What if it's not what we think?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. "What if we've triggered something we can't control?" Dr. Carter tried to push her doubts aside, but felt the same unease. "We don't know what we've triggered, but we've made contact," she replied, her voice steady. "That's what matters. Now we deal with whatever comes next." Minutes passed, the flickering symbols on the screen starting to slow. The chaotic rhythm from earlier transformed into something deliberate, as if the transmission was growing more purposeful. The air in the room grew heavier, and the temperature seemed to drop slightly. The team felt the pressure building, each passing second pushing them toward the unknown. Suddenly, the screen went dark. The room fell silent, save for the collective intake of breath. Everyone instinctively leaned forward, eyes wide with anxiety. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the screen flickered back to life. A new set of symbols appeared, more intricate, more defined than before. These weren't random characters. They formed organized patterns, almost like a message. The symbols continued to shift, still evolving, still responding. But responding to what? "It's reacting to us," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's not just sending information. It's engaging with us." Dr. Carter's heart raced as she analyzed the screen. "It's evolving. This isn't just a static message. It's alive somehow. It's learning from us." The team watched in stunned silence as the symbols grew clearer. The patterns on the screen began to take on more recognizable shapes. Geometric figures, circular motifs, and strange lines that could be maps but weren't of any place they knew. The images felt alive, shifting and pulsating with an energy that seemed to breathe. "We've made contact with something intelligent," Paul said quietly. "But this isn't just a message. It's more." Dr. Carter stood motionless, trying to process what she was seeing. Was this a message from another civilization? Or was it something entirely different? The idea that the transmission was alive, evolving in response to their actions, was beyond comprehension. It wasn't just data. It felt like they were communicating with something conscious. Then, as if in response to their collective thoughts, the symbols began to form more coherent shapes. They resembled eyes. Hundreds of them, staring back at them from the screen. A cold chill ran down Dr. Carter's spine. "It's aware of us," she whispered, her voice trembling. The room felt heavier, the weight of the realization settling in. They were no longer just observers. They were participants in something far greater than they had ever imagined. The symbols continued to evolve, revealing more of the message, but Dr. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a message. It was a warning that had already begun to manifest in the very air around them. The air in the control room grew dense with tension, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on the team. Dr. Carter and her colleagues sat frozen, their eyes glued to the screen, watching as the symbols continued to pulse with an eerie rhythm. There was no mistaking it anymore. The message was not only alive, but it was reacting to them, responding to their every move, every thought. They had stepped into a new reality, one that they were not prepared for. "What is it trying to say?" Julia whispered, her voice thick with fear. "What do we do now?" Dr. Carter couldn't answer immediately. Her mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. The symbols on the screen had become clearer, more defined, but they were still shifting, changing in ways that defied explanation. It was as if the message was evolving in real time, adapting to the team's presence. She leaned forward, her gaze narrowing in concentration. "It's not just a message anymore. It's a warning." The words left her mouth before she could even fully comprehend them, but the moment she spoke them, she realized how true they were. The air in the room seemed to hum, resonating with an energy that wasn't there before. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the room felt oddly sterile, as if they were no longer in the comfort of their own world. "We've opened something," Ben said, his voice heavy with realization. "Something we weren't supposed to." A flash of images appeared on the screen, glimpses of alien landscapes, distant stars, and strange, incomprehensible structures that seemed to float in the darkness. These weren't just pictures, they were visions, like the transmission itself was showing them fragments of something bigger, something far more terrifying. "I think we're seeing the beginning of something much worse," Paul added, his voice filled with dread. "This isn't just a message anymore, it's a warning of something that's coming." Dr. Carter's stomach tightened. They had been given a glimpse of something extraordinary, but they hadn't been prepared for the price. As the team watched in disbelief, the symbols on the screen began to form more concrete shapes, lines that seemed to converge, pointing to something in the distance, something ominous. And then they saw it, a black void, a massive infinite space that seemed to stretch out before them like a yawning abyss. "This isn't just a message," Dr. Carter said again, her voice shaking. "It's a map, a path." The realization hit the team all at once. The symbols weren't just words, they were guiding them somewhere. But where? And what would happen once they followed that path? "We're not just observing," Julia whispered, eyes wide. "We're being pulled into this." Dr. Carter swallowed hard, the weight of the situation settling on her chest. "We've opened a door, and now we have to decide if we're going to walk through it." The screen flickered again, and the image of the void was replaced by something else. A single, glowing point of light, pulsating steadily in the center. It was almost inviting them, as if saying, "Come closer." But Dr. Carter knew better. This was no invitation. It was a warning, and yet there was no turning back. They had crossed into something far beyond human understanding. "Do we continue?" Ben asked, his voice low and uncertain. Dr. Carter paused for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "We have no choice. We have to find out what this is." And with that, the next step into the unknown began. The control room was suffocatingly quiet, only the soft hum of the equipment breaking the tense stillness. Dr. Carter stood before the screen, her eyes locked on the symbols that continued to shift and pulse, as if they had a life of their own. The glow from the screen illuminated the faces of her team, all of them frozen, their expressions a mix of awe, fear, and confusion. The message that had been unfolding was unlike anything they had ever encountered. And now, it was evolving into something more unsettling. "We've crossed a line," Daniels muttered, his voice low. "I don't know if we can go back from this." Dr. Carter didn't respond at first. Her fingers hovered over the console, her mind racing. She had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, she felt a cold, paralyzing uncertainty. The images on the screen were not just symbols anymore. They were patterns, strange geometrical shapes that seemed to shift in a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. "We have no choice," Dr. Carter said quietly, the weight of the decision settling in. "We've already taken the first step. Now we have to see it through." The air in the room felt thick, charged with an unnatural energy. The temperature had dropped significantly, and Dr. Carter could feel a chill creeping up her spine. The transmission on the screen was changing faster now, as if it was responding to their presence. The symbols morphed into new shapes, growing more intricate and unsettling with each passing second. Julia, standing behind Dr. Carter, leaned in closer to the screen, her breath shallow. "What is it? What are we looking at?" she asked, her voice trembling. It's not like anything we've ever seen. It's alive, isn't it?" Dr. Carter nodded slowly, a deep sense of dread filling her. The symbols weren't just information anymore. They were evolving, responding to them in real time. It wasn't just a message anymore. It was something active, alive even, and it was becoming aware of them. They had made contact with something far beyond their understanding, and the reality of that was beginning to hit hard. "What are we dealing with?" Paul asked, his voice shaky, filled with fear. "This isn't just a message. This feels like it's something else, a force." Dr. Carter's pulse quickened. She could feel the growing tension in the room, the shared fear that was beginning to suffocate them. What had they unlocked? Was it a message, a warning, or something much worse? The screen flickered again, and the symbols began to pulse faster. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and the air grew heavy, thick with an unknown presence. It felt as if the room was alive, as though the very walls were listening, responding to what was unfolding on the screen. "We need to stop," Paul urged, but his voice was weak, as if the fear had taken hold of him. "We all know what we're dealing with. This could be dangerous." Carter's face was set with resolve. "We can't stop now," she said firmly. "We've come this far. We have to understand what this is." Just as she entered the next command, the screen flickered and went dark. The room fell silent. Then, as if the transmission had been waiting for them to act, the screen flickered back to life. A single word appeared, glowing ominously on the screen. "Welcome." The message had arrived. The unknown had made contact, and there was no turning back. ... The room was heavy with tension, the silence palpable as the team watched the screen. Dr. Carter's eyes were fixed on the transmission, her heart pounding in her chest. The word "welcome" still lingered on the screen, glowing ominously in the dark room. It wasn't just a message, it was an invitation. But what was it inviting them to? And what would happen if they accepted? "Do we respond?" Daniels asked, his voice shaking with a mix of curiosity and fear. "What are we even responding to?" Dr. Carter remained still, her mind racing. She had thought she was prepared for something like this, but now, as the gravity of the situation settled over her, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something far beyond their comprehension. The symbols, the message, the transmission, it was all too much. Yet there was no going back now. "We don't have a choice." Dr. Carter finally said, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "We've already crossed the line. We have to respond, even if we don't understand what this is." Julia stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the glowing word on the screen. "But why us? Why now? What if we're making a mistake? What if this is a trap?" The room grew colder as Dr. Carter's words echoed in her mind. What if this is a trap? What if responding meant stepping into something they couldn't control? The unknown was vast, and they were standing at its threshold, uncertain of what lay beyond. "We've already made contact," Dr. Carter said, her voice firm. "Now we have to see it through. We don't know what we're dealing with, but we can't turn back." The team was silent, unsure of what to do next. The weight of their decision was pressing down on them. They had already made history, but now it was up to them to decide what would happen next. The screen flickered once again, the symbols shifting and rearranging, as though the message was waiting for their response. "What if it's too much for us to handle?" Paul asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We could be unleashing something we don't understand." "I don't know, Dr. Gamma," Carter admitted, her gaze still locked on the screen. "But what if we don't respond? What if this is our only chance to understand something greater than ourselves?" The room seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with unease. Dr. Carter could feel the weight of her team's gaze on her, their expectations and fears hanging in the air like a thick fog. The unknown was staring them in the face, and there was no escaping it. She had to make a decision that could change everything. With a deep breath, Dr. Carter entered the next command, sending their response into the abyss of space. The symbols on the screen seemed to pulse in response, as if acknowledging their message. But what would follow? As the transmission continued to evolve, Dr. Carter realized that this was only the beginning. Whatever lay ahead, they had already stepped into the unknown, and there was no turning back. The screen flickered and hummed, casting an eerie glow over the room as the symbols continued to shift. Dr. Carter's eyes were wide with both awe and fear. The response they had just sent out had triggered something they couldn't explain. The symbols on the screen no longer looked random. They had formed a new sequence, one that appeared to be more cohesive, almost like a story unfolding right before their eyes. It's responding differently now," Daniels whispered, his voice shaky. "It's not just symbols anymore. It's like a pattern, a narrative." Dr. Carter leaned in, her breath catching in her throat. The symbols weren't just changing. They were telling a story that was unfolding in real time, with each new wave of energy pulsing from the screen. It was as if the transmission itself had come alive, feeding them more information than they could comprehend. "Look at this," Julia said, her voice barely audible. She pointed at the screen, where the symbols seemed to arrange themselves into a sequence that resembled an ancient form of writing. But this writing was different. Too fluid, too intricate. It was like nothing humanity had ever encountered. Dr. Carter's mind raced. What did it mean? What was this story trying to tell them? And more importantly, what was its purpose? Each new symbol that appeared seemed to add to a larger picture, a puzzle they couldn't yet solve. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a transmission from another civilization. It was something far more ancient, far more complex. As the symbols on the screen shifted again, they began to form an image. It was abstract, yet somehow familiar. A spiral, a never-ending loop, and at the center, a faint glow. It was as if the library, the entity behind the transmission, was revealing something hidden deep within its core, something that had been waiting for them to reach this point. "We've uncovered something," Dr. Carter said, her voice shaking with the weight of the moment. Something ancient. Something beyond our understanding. The air in the room felt thicker now, more charged. The transmission wasn't just answering their questions anymore. It was giving them something. But what? What if this is the key to everything? Paul asked, his voice filled with a mix of awe and dread. What if this is what we were meant to find? The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The weight of what they were witnessing was sinking in, and yet they still didn't fully understand the implications. Were they prepared for what this key might unlock? Were they ready to face whatever lay behind the veil? I don't know, Dr. Carter replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But we have to find out. With that, she pressed a key on the console, sending another signal into the transmission. The room held its breath as they waited for the next wave of answers. The symbols flickered one final time, and then the transmission paused. The screen went dark for a moment before something new appeared. A message. We'd have shown you the way. The next step is yours. Dr. Carter's heart raced. The message wasn't just an invitation, it was a command. And now, they had to decide whether they would take the next step into the unknown. The room fell into an unsettling silence as the team processed the message that had just appeared on the screen. Dr. Carter stared at the words. We have shown you the way. The next step is yours. The weight of those words settled over her like a heavy fog. What did it mean? And more importantly, what did the next step entail? Julia, standing beside her, spoke first. Do we really take that next step? Her voice was barely above a whisper, filled with uncertainty. The fear in her eyes mirrored the thoughts running through Dr. Carter's mind. Could they trust this? Was this something they were truly ready for? I don't know if we have a choice, Dr. Carter replied, her voice steady but tinged with anxiety. We've already opened the door. This isn't just about curiosity anymore. We've been chosen. The library is showing us something far beyond our understanding. But what if we're not ready? Paul interjected, his tone heavy with fear. What if we step into something we can't control? We don't even know what it is or where it leads. The air in the room grew thicker with each passing second. The team was on the edge, teetering between the known and the unknown, faced with a decision that could alter everything. Dr. Carter knew that whatever they chose, there was no going back. We've already crossed that line, she said, turning to face them all. We don't have the luxury of turning back now. Whatever happens next, we face it together. We can't back down from this. Daniels, who had been silent for a while, finally spoke. But we don't know what we're dealing with. This library, this entity, it's not like anything we've ever encountered. It's alive. We don't even know if we're dealing with something peaceful or something far darker. His words hit like a cold gust of wind. They hadn't considered that possibility. That this library, this living, evolving entity, might not be benevolent. But Dr. Carter knew deep down that they had already made contact. They had already begun something that couldn't be undone. The real question now was whether they would proceed or let the unknown remain locked away forever. The symbols on the screen pulsed again, almost as if urging them to act. The team stood in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. The next step was clear. They had to respond, but the consequences were unknown. Dr. Carter swallowed hard. If we walk away now, we'll never know what could have been. We'll never understand the full extent of this discovery. I believe we have a responsibility, not just to ourselves, but to humanity, to see this through. There was a long pause before Julia nodded, her face pale but resolute. You're right, she said, her voice steady. We've come this far. We can't stop now. One by one, the team members exchanged looks. their fear and uncertainty still present, but now overshadowed by a sense of resolve. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the equipment. With a deep breath, Dr. Carter reached for the console and typed in the command to continue the transmission. As the screen flickered, the room seemed to hold its breath. The next step had been chosen. The unknown was now waiting, and they had crossed the threshold. There was no turning back. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension as the team watched the screen in silence. The transmission from the alien library had already shifted, evolving in ways none of them could have predicted. The symbols were no longer static. They were alive, pulsating with energy, adapting in real time. Dr. Carter's heart raced as the screen flickered again, showing a sequence of shapes and diagrams that appeared to form a larger pattern. "It's responding to us," Julia whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It's alive in a way we can't explain." Dr. Carter nodded, her eyes fixed on the screen. There was no denying it anymore. What they had uncovered wasn't just an alien message. It was a living entity, aware of their presence, actively engaging with them. The more they interacted, the more the message morphed. It wasn't merely giving them information. It was challenging them to understand. The symbols on the screen twisted into shapes that resembled nothing human, flowing and shifting like a sentient organism. Some appeared to be intricate diagrams, while others seemed like abstract representations of concepts. It was clear now. This wasn't just communication. It was an invitation to understand something far beyond human perception. "We need to decode this," Paul said, his voice shaky with excitement and fear. "But it's changing too quickly. How can we possibly keep up?" Dr. Carter stared at the screen, her mind racing. "We're not just decoding it anymore, Paul," she said quietly. "We're part of it now. We've crossed into something far beyond our understanding, and it's pulling us deeper." The room felt smaller, as the symbols seemed to invade every corner of the control room. The team was no longer just spectators. They were participants in a living, breathing exchange. The sense of being watched, observed by something ancient and powerful, was overwhelming. Dr. Carter could feel the weight of it settling over her like an invisible pressure, like a presence that was constantly evaluating their every move. "This isn't just about knowledge," Daniel said, his voice strained. "This is about power. What if we're dealing with something that doesn't want to be known? What if we're provoking something that could be dangerous?" The tension in the room grew as the symbols flickered once again, this time forming a clear, coherent message. It wasn't in words, but in images. Images of stars, of planets, and of alien landscapes that seemed to stretch out into infinity. The message wasn't simply showing them something. It was offering them a glimpse into something vast and unimaginable. "This is beyond us," Dr. Carter said, her voice trembling. "We've opened the door to something we can't even begin to comprehend, but we can't turn away now." The screen pulsed again, the energy from the symbols intensifying, almost as if it was trying to communicate something more urgent. The team stood in stunned silence as the message continued to evolve before them. The unknown was no longer a distant concept. It was here, in the room with them, and it was waiting for them to understand. But what was it waiting for? The screen flickered again, and the room fell into a deep silence. The symbols on the screen had changed once more, and this time, the message was no longer just an invitation or a puzzle. It was a warning. The air around them grew colder, and the hum of the machinery grew louder, as if the entire room was resonating with the message itself. Dr. Carter stared at the symbols, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make sense of them. There were no words, no obvious meaning, just images that seemed to pulse and shift, taking on darker, more unsettling shapes. It was as if the message was alive, growing more intense with each passing moment. Her heart raced as she realized they had crossed into a new territory. They weren't just communicating with an alien entity. They were being warned. "Look at this," Paul said, his voice barely a whisper. He pointed at the screen where the symbols were morphing into jagged, sharp-edged shapes. The images were no longer beautiful or awe-inspiring. They were frightening. The once intricate diagrams and flowing patterns had turned into chaotic forms that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Dr. Carter's breath caught in her throat. The shapes were familiar now, circular patterns, spirals, and jagged lines, but they weren't a part of any language they knew. They were evolving faster, becoming more menacing with each shift. And then, for the first time, a sequence of words appeared, but they weren't in any language Dr. Carter had ever seen before. They were distorted, fragmented, and appeared to flicker in and out of existence. "We have to be careful," Julia whispered, her eyes wide with concern. "What if this is a trap? What if we've been lured into something we can't escape from?" The words on the screen formed into a new sequence, and this time, Dr. Carter could make out part of the message. It wasn't clear, but the sense of urgency was undeniable. It was a warning, an undeniable, clear message telling them to stop. But what was it warning them about? "They're telling us to leave," Dr. Carter said, her voice shaking as she tried to absorb the weight of what they were seeing. "It's not a message of discovery anymore. It's a message of danger." Suddenly, the screen went black. The room felt as if it had been plunged into darkness, and the team froze. For a brief moment, it seemed like they had lost everything: their connection to the alien entity, their understanding of the symbols, and their sense of safety. Then, with a sharp burst of light, the screen flickered back to life. The symbols flashed rapidly, almost too quickly to follow. But one thing was clear: the warning had intensified. The words that had appeared earlier began to repeat themselves, but now they were clearer, more direct. They weren't just warnings anymore. They were threats. "The entity is telling us to leave," Dr. Carter said, her voice steady despite the terror creeping up her spine. "We've awakened something we weren't supposed to, and now it wants us gone." A sudden realization hit her like a jolt of electricity. They hadn't just stumbled upon an ancient alien library. They had uncovered something far more dangerous, a force that didn't want to be disturbed. The message wasn't just a warning, it was a command, and it was clear. They had to leave before it was too late. The team stood motionless in front of the screen, the weight of the warning still hanging heavy in the air. Dr. Carter's mind raced. What had they just uncovered? The message was clear now. An undeniable threat, a force they could not comprehend. The feeling of dread, of something far more powerful than they could understand, pressed down on them. The air in the room felt different, charged with an unsettling energy. The temperature had dropped further, and the hum of the machinery had shifted, its tone growing darker, more menacing. It was as if the entire room had become a part of the alien entity they had been communicating with. It wasn't just a library or a message. It was a living force, and it was aware of them. They had crossed a line, and now they had to face the consequences. "We have to shut this down," Paul said, his voice tight, filled with urgency. His eyes darted to the control panel, his hands hovering over the keys, as if ready to cut off the connection. But Dr. Carter couldn't bring herself to move. The warning was clear. They were no longer in control. The library, or whatever it was, had become an active force, alive, watching, and now it seemed threatening them. She could feel the pressure building, a sense of inevitability that made her stomach churn. "We can't just disconnect," Dr. Carter said, her voice strained. "It's too late. It's already aware of us, And if we disconnect now, who knows what could happen? Ben, who had been silent for most of the conversation, stepped forward. But what if we keep going? He asked, his voice trembling. What if we're unleashing something we can't control? We have no idea what we're dealing with. Dr. Carter looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. He was right. They had no idea. And the more they uncovered, the more they realized that the library was something far beyond what they had imagined. What had started as a scientific curiosity had quickly turned into something far more dangerous. I don't know what's going to happen next, Dr. Carter said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I do know we can't turn back now. We've already opened the door. Now, we have to see it through. The team was silent, each of them contemplating the gravity of what they were about to do. Dr. Carter felt a strange mix of fear and determination welling up inside her. They were standing at the edge of something monumental, something that could change everything they knew about the universe and about themselves. Suddenly, the screen flickered again, and the symbols began to shift once more. The shapes seemed to grow more complex, swirling into patterns that felt like they were pulling the team in. The sense of being watched, of being drawn deeper into the library's grip, intensified. This is it, Julia said, her voice shaking. We've crossed the point of no return. Dr. Carter nodded, feeling the weight of the words sink in. There was no going back now. They were on the precipice of something far bigger than they could have ever imagined. The descent had begun, and there was no telling where it would lead them. The tension in the room was unbearable, the silence punctuated only by the low hum of the machines. Dr. Carter stood in front of the console, eyes fixed on a screen. The alien symbols had intensified, growing more intricate and alive with every passing second. Each new pattern was more complex, more alien, as if the library, or whatever it was drawing them deeper into its labyrinthine depths. We're not just observing anymore, Daniel said, his voice low and full of awe. We're part of it now. Dr. Carter glanced over at him, her heart racing. He was right. The closer they got to deciphering the symbols, the more it felt like the very essence of the message was merging with their own consciousness. It wasn't just a message anymore. It was an invitation, a call to something far beyond their comprehension. And it was pulling them in, inexorably, like a black hole. She watched as the symbols began to shift again, forming into a new pattern. This one was different. The shapes were familiar now. Lines, curves, spirals, all interwoven into a vast interconnected web. But the meaning was still unclear. What was it trying to convey? What did the library want from them? And why was it still evolving, still changing? It's reacting to us, Julia said, her voice barely a whisper. The more we interact with it, the more it adapts. It's like it's learning from us. Dr. Carter's mind raced. Was that possible? Could the library, or whatever this was, actually be evolving in real time? Or was it merely feeding on their presence, feeding on their curiosity? The thought made her stomach twist. What if they were unknowingly playing into its hands? The lights in the room flickered, a sudden surge of electricity coursing through the equipment. The screen pulsed with an otherworldly energy, and for a brief moment, everything in the room seemed to vibrate. It was as if the air itself had thickened, pressing in on them, forcing them to confront the magnitude of what was happening. "We've come too far," Paul said, his voice trembling. "I don't know if we can stop now." Dr. Carter hesitated. She had always believed in the power of discovery, in the pursuit of knowledge. But now, with the weight of what they had uncovered pressing down on her, she wasn't sure what the right decision was anymore. Was this still about exploration? Or had they unwittingly crossed a line, one that they could never uncross. "We can't turn back," Dr. Carter said, her voice steady but heavy with resolve. "We've opened the door. Now we have to see where it leads." The team exchanged uneasy glances, but they all knew she was right. There was no going back. They had already been consumed by the mystery. The library had awakened something in them. A hunger for knowledge, yes, but also something darker. Something far more dangerous. The symbols on the screen began to pulse faster, as though responding to Dr. Carter's words. It was as if the very universe was shifting around them, folding in on itself, drawing them deeper into its secrets. They were no longer just observers. They were part of it now. And they had no idea what it wanted from them, or what would happen if they dared to uncover more. The air in the control room had thickened with tension. Dr. Carter's eyes were fixed on the screen, but her mind was elsewhere, drowning in the overwhelming weight of what they had uncovered. The symbols on the screen, once random and incomprehensible, had transformed into something far more defined, far more unsettling. They had become a message, no, a warning, etched in an alien language that seemed to pulse with energy, as if alive. Every flicker, every shift, seemed to reverberate with an unspoken threat. The team had stopped speaking. There was no need for words. The reality of what was unfolding hit them like a punch to the gut. They were no longer just decoding symbols. They were interacting with something far beyond human understanding. Something far older and more powerful. "We've gone too far," Paul said, breaking the silence, his voice strained with fear. "What if we're inviting something we can't control?" Dr. Carter didn't respond immediately. Her thoughts were racing, but her body was still, as if frozen in place. She had long known that the pursuit of knowledge came with risks, but this was different. The energy on the screen felt far too real. It wasn't just data or information. They were communicating with something that could see them, feel them. And now it was beginning to show them something. The symbols started to shift once again, and this time they formed a shape, a face. Not human. No, not anything close to human. The face on the screen was massive, its eyes dark and all-knowing. It seemed to be staring right through them, past the screen and into their very souls. Dr. Carter felt a chill run down her spine. "It's watching us," Daniels whispered, his voice cracking. "It knows we're here." The face on the screen began to smile, but it was a smile that sent shivers through Dr. Carter's entire body. The expression was not one of warmth, but one of recognition, like the entity had been waiting for them. The smile faded, replaced by a single word, this time written in plain English: "Welcome." Dr. Carter's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a message anymore. It was an invitation. "What does it mean?" Julia asked, her voice barely audible. Dr. Carter didn't answer immediately. Her mind raced, but she couldn't find the words. The message had been clear, an invitation, yes, but it was more than that. It was a challenge. They had unlocked something, and now the question remained: what would they do next? The air around them seemed to thicken, becoming charged with something almost tangible. Dr. Carter's fingers hovered over the console, but she hesitated. What had they just discovered? What had they awakened? "Do we respond?" Paul asked, his voice heavy with doubt. The team looked at Dr. Carter, waiting for her decision. She glanced back at the screen, the word "welcome" still glowing, pulsing with an energy that felt both inviting and dangerous. "We have no choice," she said finally, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "We've come this far. Now, we need to know what it wants." With a trembling hand, Dr. Carter pressed a button on the console. The screen flickered, and for a brief moment, the room fell into darkness. The unknown had begun to respond. The room felt suffocating as the screen flickered back to life. The words, "Welcome," still hovered in front of them, but they were no longer static. The text shifted, changing into a series of symbols that were impossible to decipher at first glance. Dr. Carter's heart raced, her pulse quickening as she watched the screen with a mixture of dread and awe. This was it. The moment they had feared, the moment they had unknowingly invited. "We've crossed a line," Paul said, his voice tense, a tremor of fear hidden in his words. "We don't know what it means. What happens now?" Dr. Carter didn't answer right away. She was staring at the screen, trying to make sense of the symbols that were transforming before her eyes. It wasn't just a communication anymore. It was a manifestation, an entity, alive and aware, pulling them into its world. It felt like something was reaching out through the screen, and Dr. Carter wasn't sure if they were meant to interact with it or if they were being drawn in. The symbols shifted once more, this time forming a shape, almost like a door. But it wasn't a literal door, more like an abstract representation of one. The lines were geometric, interwoven with spirals, pulsating like the rhythm of a heartbeat. It was an invitation, but it felt like a trap. The walls in the room seemed to close in on them, the air thick with the tension of their collective uncertainty. "Are we really going to do this?" Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was still staring at the screen, her face pale, as if she could feel the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. "We don't have a choice," Dr. Carter said, her voice calm but resolute. "We've already made contact. This isn't just a signal anymore. It's a living message. We have to understand what it's trying to tell us." Her hand hovered over the console, trembling slightly as she prepared to make a move. The team held their breath, waiting for Dr. Carter to take the next step. The clock was ticking. Every second they spent in this moment felt like an eternity. They were standing on the precipice of something unimaginable, and they had no way of knowing if they were ready for what lay beyond. "I don't like this," Paul muttered, stepping back slightly. "It's too much. We don't know what we're dealing with." Dr. Carter looked back at him, her expression unreadable. She understood his fear. She shared it. But something inside her, the same drive that had pushed her to explore the unknown, compelled her to move forward. "We've crossed this threshold already," Dr. Carter said, her voice low but firm. "We can't go back. We need to understand what this door is showing us." As she pressed the button to initiate the next step, the symbols on the screen swirled, shifting rapidly. The room seemed to pulse with energy as the door-like image began to widen, revealing a glimpse of something beyond. Something vast, endless, and dark. It was as though the very fabric of the universe itself was unfolding before their eyes, and they had no choice but to walk through. With a final, decisive motion, Dr. Carter activated the sequence, and the door opened wider, a pathway into the unknown. The team exchanged nervous glances, but there was no turning back. The doorway was open, and whatever was waiting on the other side, they were about to find out. The air in the control room grew thick as the screen flickered, revealing the open doorway, a vast expanse, pulsing with a dark, otherworldly energy. It wasn't just a visual. It felt as though the room itself was being drawn into it. The walls seemed to stretch and contract with each new pulse, as though the very fabric of reality was bending to the will of what they had unleashed. The team stood frozen, a mixture of awe and terror rooted to the spot. Carter's heart raced, her hands clammy as she hovered over the console. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to pull away, but there was something deeper, something irresistible that pushed her forward. "What is that?" Julia whispered, her voice trembling as she stared at the screen. The darkness beyond the doorway seemed to beckon them, swirling like a black hole, drawing them in. I don't know, Dr. Carter admitted, her throat tight. But we've opened it. It's too late to back out now. Ben looked over at Dr. Carter, his expression a mix of fear and disbelief. We don't know what we're dealing with. It's not just a message anymore. It's like we're being invited into something ancient. This feels wrong. Dr. Carter took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving the screen. We don't have a choice. We have to know what's on the other side. We've crossed this line, and there's no turning back. As she spoke, the symbols on the screen began to shift again, morphing into complex patterns that seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm. It was as though the doorway was alive, its very form reacting to their presence. The strange, shifting designs took on a life of their own, growing more intricate, more foreboding with each passing second. We're not just looking at a message, Paul muttered, his voice tight with anxiety. We're looking at an invitation, but for what? The screen seemed to vibrate, the deep hum of energy filling the room as the doorway expanded even further. The darkness within seemed to grow, revealing glimpses of what lay beyond. Shapes, figures, landscapes that were impossible to comprehend, as if existing in a different dimension entirely. Dr. Carter's gaze hardened, her resolve strengthening despite the creeping fear in the back of her mind. It's not a matter of choice anymore. Whatever this is, it's responding to us. It's like it's waiting for us to step through, and we need to understand what it's offering. The room felt colder, the energy in the air intensifying. There was a weight to it now, like gravity itself had shifted, pulling them closer to the unknown. The team exchanged uneasy glances, but they knew deep down that this was the only path left. We're moving forward, Dr. Carter said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. The unknown is right in front of us, and we can't ignore it. She pressed the button, sending the signal to fully open the doorway. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through their bodies. The symbols on the screen were no longer just symbols. They were forming something new, something alive. And as the doorway opened wider, revealing the darkness beyond, Dr. Carter knew one thing for sure. They were about to step into something that would change everything. The darkness beyond the doorway continued to expand, its depth seemingly endless. The room felt as though it had shrunk around them, the hum from the screen now vibrating in their bones. The symbols on the screen had faded, replaced by a shifting mass of pure darkness, something that defied comprehension. Dr. Carter felt her heart race, her body stiffening, her mind struggling to process what they were witnessing. It was as if they had crossed into another realm entirely. I can't see anything, Julia whispered, her voice barely audible in the thick silence. It's just black. The eerie blackness on the screen seemed to pulse with a life of its own, shifting like smoke caught in a breeze. But there was something more, something buried beneath the surface. It wasn't just empty space. The darkness itself felt alive, a presence that was watching them, aware of their every move. Ben swallowed hard, his voice shaky. Feels like we're not supposed to be here, like we've trespassed into something's domain. Dr. Carter's gaze was locked on the screen, her mind racing. She felt the weight of his words. They'd stepped into a space beyond their understanding. They had crossed a threshold that had been uninvited, unanticipated, and yet here they were, on the brink of encountering something that might change everything. Suddenly, the air around them grew colder, and the room seemed to darken further. The hum from the screen grew louder, vibrating through their bodies. A shiver ran down Dr. Carter's spine, but she refused to look away. They were too close to turn back now. The unknown had beckoned them, and they had answered. Then, as if in response to their presence, the screen flickered again. A single symbol appeared in the blackness, a sharp, angular shape that seemed to crackle with energy. It was unlike anything they had seen before, its edges jagged, its form pulsing as if it were alive. "It's coming from the dark space," Dr. Carter said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like it's trying to communicate with us." The symbol on the screen began to shift, its jagged edges curling and bending, forming what appeared to be a face, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't a human face, but something far more alien. The eyes were large, unblinking and dark, and they seemed to pierce right through the team, locking onto them with an intensity that made Dr. Carter's breath catch in her throat. "We're not alone," Paul said, his voice trembling. "This thing, whatever it is, it's watching us." The team stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing in on them. The face on the screen seemed to grow more defined, its presence more tangible. The tension in the room became suffocating. Dr. Carter could feel her pulse quickening, her body on edge. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to shut down the system, to end this madness. But deep down, she knew they had crossed a line. There was no going back. "I think it wants us to understand," Dr. Carter said, her voice shaking with uncertainty. "It's trying to communicate." As the symbol morphed further, the face grew clearer, and for the briefest moment, Dr. Carter could swear the eyes blinked. And then the darkness shifted, swallowing the face whole, leaving them in an even deeper abyss than before. The screen blinked once, and then silence. The encounter had begun, and they had no idea what would come next. The silence in the room was deafening. The team stood motionless, the air around them thick with anticipation and fear. The screen had gone dark once again, leaving them in the same void of uncertainty they had been in since the encounter began. Dr. Carter's heart raced as she stared at the screen, willing it to respond. They had crossed into something beyond their comprehension, and now they could only wait to see what came next. But then, a flicker, a subtle shift in the darkness, a whisper of light. The screen came to life once more. This time, there was no face, no sharp symbol. Instead, there were shapes, fluid, flowing like liquid moving through space. The patterns twisted and writhed as if something was being formed in real time, constantly changing, evolving before their eyes. "We're not in control anymore," Julia said softly, her voice laced with awe and dread. She took a step back, her eyes still fixed on the screen. "This isn't just a message anymore, it's a process." Dr. Carter's fingers hovered above the console, her breath shallow. She knew that what they were witnessing wasn't just an alien message, it was something far more profound. The symbols, the shapes, the shifting patterns, all of it was unfolding, responding to them, interacting with their presence. And the deeper they went, the more they realized how little they understood. The room's temperature dropped again, a sudden chill that crawled under their skin. The symbols on the screen seemed to pulse, sending out waves of energy that reverberated through the air. The team flinched as a low hum filled the room, vibrating the walls and floor beneath them. It was as though the very fabric of reality was bending to the will of whatever was on the other side. This isn't just information," Paul said, his voice shaking. "It's trying to do something to us." The realization hit Dr. Carter like a wave. The message wasn't simply telling them something, it was pulling them in. It was altering the very nature of their existence. The symbols on the screen shifted again, this time revealing a series of geometric shapes that seemed to align with their thoughts, their intentions. as though the library, or whatever intelligence lay behind it, was reading them, understanding them on a level they couldn't even begin to grasp. "What is it trying to tell us?" Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. Dr. Carter took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She could feel it now, the pull, the invitation. Whatever this entity was, it wasn't just communicating with them. It was guiding them, and it had already set its plan in motion. "It's not about us anymore," Dr. Carter said, her voice steady but filled with a growing sense of dread. "We've opened the door, and now we have to decide if we walk through it." The symbols on the screen began to converge, the shapes forming into something that resembled an eye, huge, watching, unblinking. The eye blinked once, then twice, and then the screen went black again. The message had ended, but Dr. Carter knew this wasn't the end of their journey. The truth was unraveling before them, and it was only just beginning. They had crossed the threshold, and now there was no turning back.